Hi, I'm Andromeda Yu, and this is part 5 of 30 Years in the Golden North. It's been about 6 months since the last part, and I'm sorry about that. But I'm back, and I am waiting on the video that I said I was going to make next, which was one that I hoped would be able to look at a map and track where our author has been so far. And I actually realized it's probably better this way because after this section, we're coming to a break and it starts a part 2 that has a new title. So I guess it's, in his mind, just a different phase of his journey or his life. So it works out. And I will continue trying to do that after I put this part up. Because I had been writing down the places on a note card so I can look them up and make a little trail and recap maybe some interesting things that he found in each place. So I hopefully will still get to that. It's just taking me longer than I thought. And I was in a position where I couldn't really make my videos for the last 6 months because I was staying with my grandma and helping her with a lot of my time after work. But without any other explanation, this section begins, My Hardships on the Bear Islands. I pitched a tent, left the reindeer on the pasture, and at once fell asleep. I did not feel anxious. I was convinced that there were people on the island, and that I should live among them until the ice melted, and some whaling ship made its appearance off the island. I would work on board, if necessary, only in return for my keep, but I must get to the north. On all sides, I was told that there was often a shortage of good hands on the whalers, and that every captain was glad to engage anyone, especially when he had expert knowledge and could help on board like myself, who was not only an able seaman, but in addition, a skillful locksmith. Apart from the tundra, there was no trace of any vegetation here. I had heard that on the islands in the Arctic Ocean, there were coal deposits just under the rock surface, and that it was always possible to find driftwood on the shore. So I walked to and fro along the shore and looked to see if there was any wood which had been washed up from the mainland in the summer, but there was none. So I ate some dry fish and a stale pancake, and with it munched some pieces of ice, which was now getting quite porous, because the time was not far when it began to drift and disappear. One day, a second, a third, a fourth passed in this manner. I watched my reindeer enjoying their feed on the tundra, while I chewed cold dried fish and stale fritters and sucked pieces of ice. As I was chilled to the bone, I finally decided that I would use the rest of the alcohol which I still had with me, and which was only just enough for boiling a pot of tea, that I would pick some lichens on the tundra and boil them like tea. I had ordinary tea with me, but in my distress I thought that lichens would go a little further and be more filling. I made a pot of this tea and sweetened it thoroughly. The tea was thick and tasted strongly of oil, but I held my breath, and I drank up the whole of this unsavory liquid, being convinced that it would do me good. But before very long I began to feel queer in the stomach, walked along the tundra and vomited, so that my low spirits grew worse and worse. I felt very glum. I ran along the shore and looked to see whether there were signs of smoke anywhere, but the sky was clear, and all that could be seen in the background were the cheerless drab mountains, rising up entirely bare, and the frozen ocean on the other side. At last I said to myself that if things went on like this, I should certainly be dead within a week, for if I could not manage even to warm myself, I had to keep jumping about and running at random to and fro to produce a little warmth in my body. On the 5th day, I harnessed all the 4 reindeer, struck the tent, loaded it on the sledge, and left all the rest of my belongings and drove off toward the mountains. There I should perhaps find some people, for surely it was impossible that I should be all alone on an island of that size. In the evening I reached the foot of the rocks, which were terribly battered by storms, left the reindeer below, and started climbing up through a sort of dreary snow-covered valley, rising in the midst of the weather-beaten cliffs. How different this valley looked from the valleys, which in days gone by I used to see in the warm and cheerful landscapes of the south. There were no trees there was no flowing stream, and the slopes were not covered with green meadows, nothing but snow and silence. Good heavens, I said to myself, surely I shall find at least some animal or other which I can shoot. I must have at least a morsel of fresh meat. I wandered in the snow across the mountains from valley to valley, among the gorges, but it was in vain that I searched in untouched snow for even a single spoor. Dusk fell slowly, and I returned back to the reindeer, pitched the tent, swallowed some cold, dry fish with distaste, wrapped myself into some furs, stretched myself on the sledge, and fell asleep, completely dead beat. But I had not lost my courage. I had made up my mind that on the next day, early in the morning, I would begin to search, and would not return from the mountains empty-handed to the reindeer. I spent the whole of the next day running about among the rocks and along the valleys, until I could scarcely crawl, but I had to go back dismayed and downcast without success. Again, nothing. I cursed as I gulped down the disgusting dried fish, feeling ready to vomit at every mouthful. I decided that on the next day I would go with the reindeer as far as the end of this deserted range. Perhaps there on the shore I would find some open water, where the ice had already melted a little, perhaps, and maybe I would catch some fish. Perhaps there would be driftwood, and I would cook myself a tasty meal for once in a way. This was my last chance that I was after. The journey lasted for 2 days. At last I came to a standstill, unharnessed the reindeer, and without hesitating for a moment, ran along the shore in search of wood or some hole on the ice. It was no use. I ran up to the mountains, staring at the snow for all I was worth. There was no spoor. The island was evidently uninhabited, and I was condemned to starve there. Well, now you're in a pretty fix, I said to myself. Here you are at the last gasp on this cursed island. Before me rose sheer from the ice to the sky a rocky cape, with a steeply twisting snow-clad cliff above. It occurred to me that perhaps there was a road along which animals made their way to the sea, so I made up my mind that I would have one more try that way. I scrambled up, mounted about 100 yards, and then I smelt fish and smoke. There must be a hut somewhere about. I was close to human beings. I was saved. I ran up and down. Then I saw tracks, footprints in the snow. But where were the huts? I walked about, but could see nothing at all anywhere. Was I getting lightheaded? Had I gone mad? Why, I had caught quite a strong whiff of smoke and fish. At last, when I was at the point of despair, I remembered that the Eskimos on St. Lawrence Island had told me, namely that on the islands in the Arctic Ocean, most of the Eskimos lived under the ground in holes. Why, of course! Suddenly it dawned on me. Then I discovered one hole, there was a second one, then a third one, and there a fourth and a fifth. I knelt down beside one of the holes and took a deep breath. The most delightful fragrance which I have breathed into my nostrils never caused me such a pleasure as the disgusting stench which arose from the hole. I quickly shouted into one of the holes, "Hello! Hello! Is anybody there?" Nothing. "Hello! Hello! Here's a good man, a friend. Come and answer." No reply. I knelt down and considered what I was to do now. Were the people stone deaf, or were they unwilling to come out? I stood up and fired my rifle at random into the air. I waited. Nobody arrived. I was now beginning to lose my temper, and I fired a second time, and again I waited for a while. There was a short interval, and then I heard a rustling in the hole. Hello, someone was climbing out. Someone small, wrapped in furs. Before me stood a tiny little man, who reached as far as my shoulder. He had a crooked mouth, slanty eyes. I at once saw that it was an Eskimo, but of a different tribe than the Eskimos of St. Lawrence Island. I at once laid my hands on his shoulder and smiled at him, for I saw that he was afraid. "Do you understand Russian?" "Ga, ga, 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 ga." "Do you understand Russian? If you do, answer, or you'll feel the weight of my hand." "Ga, ga, 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 ga." I then saw that I could not make myself understood to him in Russian. I asked him in English. The same reply. He just kept on jabbering away. When I saw that there was no chance of making myself understood to him, I went off to another hole. But he got in front of me, jumped into the hole, and after a while crawled out with 2 other little men of the same kind. All 3 walked around me several times at a respectful distance, with their fingers pressed against their noses. My terribly shaggy appearance must have aroused their respect. With eyes wide open, they watched my every movement. When they had had a really good look, they began to talk amongst themselves in a sing-song, drawling language. Then one of them ran off, crawled into another hole, and brought out an old Eskimo who had white hair and a thin, white, tufty mustache. He came up to me respectfully, and I asked whether he understood Russian. Da, 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 he said, adding, Немножко, not much. That's enough, I said. You're a fine fellow. I am a comrade, a friend. And then I plied him with question after question. I told him that this was my second week there, that I had no warm food, and asked him to show me where driftwood or coal could be found, or where I could get some food. The little man immediately went with me. He led me up and down till we reached the shore, the very place where I had been looking for wood before, and there he showed me plenty of wood, which was sticking up out of the snow. Confound it all, I shouted. Why, I ran up and down there over and over again, looking for wood, and discovered nothing. I wondered how it was possible that in my agitation I could have taken those pieces of wood for stone, or simply overlooked them altogether. I also asked him where the coal came from, because from the smell of smoke I recognized that fresh coal was used here as fuel. He took me a little further up among the rocks and showed me a place where a small hole had been dug into the earth, big enough for a dog to crawl into. He said that is where the Eskimos got coal from. I had no pickaxe or shovel with me because when I started from my original quarters, I left all my things there, so as to have as light a burden as possible on the sledge. I therefore asked the Eskimos to lend me implements so that I could dig some coal and get warm. He ran off, and after a little while brought the tools along. They were small, but I knelt down and quickly dug out